Somewhere between 150 and 270,000 years ago, in a cave in what is now Spain, a child was born who could not hear a sound. And every time that child stood up, the whole world tilted sideways and began to spin. Walking was difficult. Standing still was difficult. Outside there were hyenas, there were leopards, and there were cave lions. A child like this should have died within weeks. This one lived at least 6 years, which means somebody carried that child. Somebody found food soft enough for it to eat. Somebody stayed for 6 years and got absolutely nothing back for the trouble. We know all of that from one fragment of skull the size of a coin, and that fragment points straight at the question underneath the whole of human history. Not how our ancestors lived, how any of their children reached adulthood at all. Because for almost every year our species has existed, most of them simply didn't. Here is the number that stops people cold. It is worth sitting with. Across hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists over the last century, roughly half of all children born died before they ever finished growing up. Not half of adults, half of everyone, half of every human being ever born. The estimates vary between studies, and they vary by a genuinely large margin. Some put it near 30% dying before the age of 15. Others put it closer to 50. One Paleolithic estimate goes as high as 56. And the great majority of those deaths came before the 5th birthday. Infection, parasites, a fever nobody could break, a fall, a bad season with no food. Among the Jew-Hoansi of the Kalahari, disease caused the overwhelming majority of child deaths. Tuberculosis and malaria did quietly what no predator ever needed to bother doing. So it was disease that emptied the camps, not the animals outside them. And that number is also where the biggest myth about ancient humans comes from. You have heard it 100 times. They all died at around 30 years old. That is not what the number means. It has never been what the number means. Life expectancy at birth is an average, and an average can be dragged a long way. When half of your infants die before 5, the average collapses straight downward. So take those deaths out and look only at the people who made it past 15. In 2007, Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan did exactly that calculation. They found the most common age of death was somewhere between 68 and 78. Ancient humans did not quietly die of old age at 30. Plenty grew genuinely old. Childhood was the dangerous part, not adulthood. Adulthood, if you were lucky enough to reach it, was surprisingly long and surprisingly ordinary. So the real question was never how long they lived. It is how any child got through. Start with the first problem, and easily the hardest one. Food. There was no formula, no bottles, no safe animal milk to fall back on. For the first years of a child's life, there was exactly one source of nutrition, and it worked very differently from the way most people picture it working. In the 1970s, 2 anthropologists sat down with Kung mothers in the Kalahari, and they did something nobody had bothered to do. They held stopwatches. Melvin Connor and Carol Worthman recorded every single feed, as it actually happened. Not what mothers remembered afterward, what the clock said at the time, every time. And what came out of those notebooks was genuinely startling. Babies nursed for only about 2 minutes at a stretch. Short, almost casual. But they came back roughly every 13 to 15 minutes to do it again. Dozens and dozens of times, hour after hour, right through the entire day, all day. And then repeatedly through the night as well, without a real break. Not scheduled feeds at all. Constant, tiny, on-demand contact between mother and infant. More feeds before lunch than most modern babies get across an entire day. Infants were carried in a sling, skin against skin, almost continuously for years. And a crying baby was answered in seconds rather than minutes, every time. That pattern was doing something invisible and enormously powerful. Underneath all of it, frequent nursing keeps prolactin high, and sustained high prolactin suppresses ovulation. But the researchers found something a good deal more specific than that. It was not the total time spent nursing across the day that mattered most. It was the length of the gap between one feed and the next one. The interval was doing the work, not the hours. Keep that gap short enough, for long enough, and the body simply does not restart. Kung mothers typically did not conceive again for around 35 months after a birth, just under 3 years, without anybody planning it or deciding it, which produced a gap between one child and the next of almost 4 full years. That spacing was not really a decision anybody in the camp sat down and made. It was physiology, running quietly underneath the culture and doing the arithmetic for them. And it may be the single most important survival technology our ancestors ever had. Not a tool, not a weapon. The gap between one child and the next, because one mother cannot carry and feed 2 completely helpless infants at the same time. Not while walking, not while foraging, not for years on end without collapsing. 4 years between births gave every single child a clear run at surviving. But breast milk on its own stops being enough surprisingly quickly. At around 6 months, a growing brain starts demanding more energy than milk can deliver. So when did our ancestors start adding solid food? For a long time, that was genuine guesswork. Bones do not record what a baby ate on a Tuesday. Then in 2020, researchers looked at 3 Neanderthal milk teeth recovered from a site in northern Italy, and everything changed. Because teeth grow in layers, very much like the rings inside a tree trunk. Roughly one layer laid down for every single day of a young child's life. Alessia Nava, Federico Lugli, and their colleagues sliced those teeth paper thin. Then they fired a laser across the layers and measured the strontium in each one. Strontium comes from solid food. It does not come from milk in the same way, so the chemistry had quietly recorded the exact week that solid food first arrived. The answer came back at 5 to 6 months. Neanderthal babies began taking solid food at around 5 to 6 months old, which is precisely the same window recommended for human infants today. Different species, different continent, a different ice age entirely, exactly the same biological deadline. Weaning was never really culture, it was arithmetic, and the arithmetic has not changed. But solving the milk problem immediately creates a second problem, and it is strange. A human child is weaned a very long time before it can feed itself, and that particular combination barely exists anywhere else in the natural world. Watch a chimpanzee infant. It is already picking its own fruit while still nursing, so by the time it is weaned, it is essentially independent. The transition is seamless. Human children are weaned at around 3 and stay helpless for years after that. Weaned and still completely dependent, which means somebody has to keep feeding a child who cannot yet feed itself. And that somebody, it turns out, was usually not only the mother. The anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy calls humans cooperative breeders because of this. It means we raise our children collectively, as a group, rather than in isolation. The helpers even have a name: alloparents. Anyone caring for a child who is not its biological mother or father. Aunts, older siblings, grandmothers, uncles, unrelated members of the same camp. And the data coming out of living forager societies is genuinely remarkable. Among the Aka of Central Africa, newborns are passed from person to person constantly. By around 18 weeks, infants reportedly spend more time held by other people than they spend being held by their own mother. That is not a rounding error. Among the Efe of the Ituri forest, researchers asked a very simple question. They asked, who looks after the babies here? Who is responsible for them? The answer came back in 3 words. We all do. Not the mother, not the family, everybody. And this is not neglect or a failure of care. This is the actual design. Now compare all of that with what a chimpanzee mother does with a newborn. She will barely allow another adult to touch her infant for months on end. In many primate groups, an unfamiliar adult is a genuine physical danger to an infant. Humans went in the exact opposite direction and went a very long way with it. We built our entire survival strategy on handing our babies to other people, and Hrdy argues that something much deeper than childcare started right there. A baby who has to win care from several different adults learns to watch them closely, read the face, track the attention, charm them, appeal to them, hold their interest. In her account, shared childcare helped shape the human mind into what it is. That last step is a hypothesis, not a settled fact. It is an argument from evidence, not a finding, and it is worth saying so. But the survival arithmetic sitting underneath it is very hard to argue with at all. In a world where half of all children died, extra hands were not a luxury. They were the difference between a family line carrying on and a family line ending. And one particular group of helpers may have changed that equation more than any other. In 1984, anthropologists began working alongside the Hadza in Tanzania. Kristen Hawkes, James O'Connell, and Nicholas Blurton-Jones watched the daily foraging, and they noticed something they had not gone out there looking for at all. The hardest working foragers in the whole camp were very often the oldest women, out the longest hours, coming back with the most food, consistently, day after day. And what they were bringing back turned out to matter enormously. Children can pick berries perfectly well by themselves. That takes no skill and no strength. But tubers grow deep underground, and the ground out there is genuinely hard. Small arms simply cannot lever them out. The physics does not work. Berries any child can manage. Tubers need an adult. So the older women dug them up and fed the children who had already been weaned. Then Hawkes looked at the growth data from those children and found the pattern. A child's weight gain closely tracked its own mother's foraging time, week by week, which is roughly what anybody would have expected to find, and not very interesting. Until the mother had another baby. Then something genuinely strange happened. At that exact point, the correlation switched over to somebody else entirely. The child's growth now tracked an older woman's working hours instead of its mother's. The mother had effectively been replaced, and the child carried on growing anyway. Published in 1997, this became known as the grandmother hypothesis, and it tries to explain something genuinely strange about our species. Female chimpanzees very rarely live long past the end of their fertile years. Human women routinely live for decades after menopause, in good health, still working. In this model, that is not a medical accident or a side effect. It is selection. Grandmothers who fed grandchildren allowed their own daughters to have babies sooner. It is also still argued about. It is one of the most contested ideas in human evolution, and honestly, it should be. Even in the original Hadza data, the helpers were not always literal grandmothers. Some were other older relatives entirely, with no direct line to the child at all, which points back at the same conclusion, just arriving from a different direction. What mattered was that somebody old, skilled, and experienced was invested in that child, and once you start looking for children in the deep past, you find them everywhere. In Rouffignac Cave in France, the ceilings are covered in finger flutings, lines dragged through soft mineral crust with bare hands thousands of years ago. Some researchers have attributed a share of those lines to children as young as 2, and some marks sit far too high up for any small child to have reached alone, which would mean an adult lifted them up to the ceiling so they could make them, though that reading is disputed. A 2024 study challenged the whole method of estimating age from flutings. The footprints, though, are the solid tier of evidence, and they are not in doubt. Fontenay Cave in France, infants and children. Basura Cave in Italy, 2 children, an adolescent and 2 adults, 400 meters underground, walking in together. And when children did die, they were very clearly not quietly discarded. At Sunghir in Russia, around 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried head-to-head in a single grave, laid out with real care. With them, over 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, hundreds of pierced fox teeth, ivory spears, thousands of hours of work. An adult man at the same site got far less. In Alaska, 11,500 years ago, 2 infants were buried beneath a hearth with antler points laid beside them, coated carefully in red ochre. These were communities living genuinely close to the edge of survival, every winter. And they poured enormous costly effort into children who had already died. Children were not disposable. Not then. Not ever. Which brings us back to that cave in Spain, and that fragment of skull. The fossil came out of Cova Negra, near Zativa, back in 1989. Then it sat in storage for decades, catalogued as unremarkable fragmentary bone. Only recently did researchers pull it out again and scan it properly. It was part of the right temporal bone, the piece that holds the inner ear. Micro-CT scanning built a 3-dimensional model of the delicate structures inside it. The semicircular canals, which control balance, were clearly and severely malformed. The cochlea, which handles hearing, was undersized, both together, in the same ear. That particular combination is strongly associated with one condition in living children, Down syndrome. Mercedes Conde Valverde's team published the case in 2024, carefully hedged. Neanderthals were known to care for injured adults. But an injured adult recovers and repays the group. A child who will never hear cannot. And that is exactly what makes this case different. The most important survival tool our ancestor developed was not a blade, a fire, or a spear. It was each other.